themselves to the needs of the economy. Let me give you an example. How many of you have a job? Okay. Let's say you're at work and you decide that it's time for you to go to church and pray. How easy would it be for you to leave your job and go down to the church and pray without, having to require permission of a boss or supervisor? Would that be relatively easy? No. Might be possible, but it's not easy. In that example, the religious institution must accommodate to the needs and dictates of, in this case, the job, more generally, the economic system. If you have a sick child and you must tend to him or her, very often, though not necessarily always, that requires permission from management or the owner of the business to stay at home and tend to the needs of your child. That is an example of how the family accommodates itself and indeed is required to the dictates of the economy. It used to be that Americans, and this is no lie, had shared 3 meals a day with one another. So you would get up in the morning and actually have breakfast, and everyone in the family, more or less, would show up to the table. At least they were available to eat breakfast together. And then, when you went to school, very often, certainly in my case, and this was common, you were let go from school around noon to go home and have lunch at home. And then, of course, the evening meal was shared. Indeed, it was almost sacrosanct. How many of you, just by a show of hands, share on a daily basis all 3 meals with all the other members of your family? One of you. Why is that? Let me submit that in large part, though this is certainly not the only answer or reason, it's because our work schedules conflict with these family meal schedules, and we're simply, we think, unable to get together and have these meals together. Another example in which family schedules, family rituals are accommodated to the needs of the economy. And finally, the economy dominates other institutions through a process of what we refer to as penetration. What we mean there is that economic language, economic logic becomes part and it filters into the language and logic, sort of the vocabulary of motives of other institutions as well. So that, for example, there is something very interesting about the parallel between the grading system in our educational system and the wage and salary system in our economic system, right? You, to some degree, compete for grades, and the grades then become, the higher grades become the reward for winning that competition. That grading system bears a strong resemblance to the wage and salary system. And that indeed, the grading system, wage and salary system have common origins, but it's also the case that the grading system in colleges, universities, and in high schools to some degree is modeled after the reward system in our free market economy. Next. So I suggested that compared to other societies, the economy dominates the institutional structure in the U.S. Not completely, but in a comparative or relative sense. That domination tends to weaken the social controls and social supports that are provided by other institutions. Think again about the family meal schedule. That was that ritual performed a very important function. The function was to check in with one another. It enabled parents to check in with their children and exert some control over their children's behavior. The less frequently you gather with your parents for that process, the less likely it is your parents are going to know what you're up to and are going to be able to exert some control. So that's one example of many one might give of how the dominance of the economy over other institutions may weaken the controls that other institutions provide. So I'm suggesting that the combination of the American dream with its strong emphasis on monetary success, with an institutional structure dominated by a free market economy, gives rise to a strong tendency toward what I've called anomie. That is an effort to get around, move against regulation. That shouldn't seem an oddity. And by the way, against regulation includes against the law. In other words, we're suggesting that this complex of forces is important for understanding relatively high crime rates in the U.S. We're encouraged to innovate with respect to the rules to a degree that other societies are not. But we're not directly encouraged to violate the law. That's not the suggestion. But the strong emphasis on the goal of material success, coupled with the relatively weakened social controls that social institutions can impose, given the dominance of the economy, is a recipe for relatively high rates of anomie and high rates of crime. Next, please. Let's go on. I want to move on to a little bit of evidence. So, one assertion I've made is that high rates of crime in the U.S. distinguish us from other societies. Next slide, please. Is that true? It's certainly true in the case of serious violent crime, including homicide. Here are the homicide rates for the United States, many European societies, and I think I've got Japan and Canada and Australia on there as well. 6 per 100,000 homicides in the United States, compared to a rough average of about 1 per 100,000 in those comparison societies. And the United States, by the beginning of the current century, by the year 2000, our homicide rate had declined by something like 40%, and yet we still held a command